this stratigraphy, and so I'm going to make a bunch of ad hoc modifications to the arc foreland basin fill to explain why the Karoo Basin is compatible with a foreland model. A good model for the Karoo Basin should explain the paleo-environmental variations that we see from the Western Cape to northern KwaZulu-Natal, across the uplifts of the Caledonian Highlands into Botswana, Namibia, even Zimbabwe, where we have Karoo Basin deposits. It should explain the thickness trends and the subsidence trends that we see across the basin. And a very good basin model will explain all of the contemporaneous basins that are separated from the main Karoo Basin by having very similar stratigraphy in certain time periods. And so we're going to go for something that can explain many of those points, if not all of them. We've seen before that there's 3 models for Dwight-Carr subsidence. Going back to 2004, the one that is most akin to what I'm talking about is Katunianu's retro-arc foreland model, and that has a thrust belt over here in the Carboniferous, and it has deep subsidence in the foredeep over here, a very large forebulge that is essentially all of the Karpfall craton, except the most distal part where basement structures start to influence subsidence, and so the back bulge is not a smooth transition but a fault-bounded block. And so that's kind of a modified foreland system model for the Dwight-Carr group. Ice sheets exist on the forebulge, and so you have low subsidence and thin deposits over here, and thick deposits of glacial and glacial marine sediment over there. Extensional sag basins, perhaps the first time this showed up in a prominent way is in the publication by Tankard et al. 2009. And this is a good explanation for the facies distribution that you see in the Dwight-Carr, going from deeper water deposits to shallower water deposits from south to north. One of the critical things that we see in the Karoo Basin is the absence of shallow water and marginal marine deposits in the southern part in the earliest periods of fill. That's an important point, and one that needs an explanation. So you go from deeper water deposits to shallow water deposits. We have evidence in Dwight-Carr time of tillites interacting with substrate in glacial pavements, even around the northern Cape, Kimberley, and so on. So there is a fairly southern extent to continental glaciation. And another model that has shown up in the literature is Fisser's back arc extensional sag basin model. This is not one that I'm going to spend a great deal of time on because I suspect it came out in response to sandstone provenance interpretations of an inferred arc, which no one has ever located again. So back arc extensional sag hasn't really picked up any momentum. Looking briefly at stratigraphic thicknesses across a bunch of places, this is going for the big picture at the expense of much detail. There are great stratigraphic thickness variations, especially in Dwight-Carr deposits around northern KwaZulu-Natal, where basement highs and inferred glacially carved valleys cause various types of fluctuations. Perhaps one of the most important transitions that needs to be explained is the transition from diamictite to very deep marine shale, and in some cases continental diamictites, to very deep water environments very rapidly. The Dwight-Carr Prince Albert contact preserves the onset of very, very rapid subsidence. And that is something that can be explained tectonically by a foreland basin model. And so that's one important feature that is preserved. The Dwight-Carr group and Prince Albert and Lower Ekka preserve thick successions that are dominantly marine in the Western Cape, and also in southwestern Namibia. Whereas when we go to the middle of Botswana, northern South Africa, and many other basins in northern South Africa and Zimbabwe, Mozambique, these successions are much thinner, and they have much less of a deep water flavor to them. So there's a definite environmental change that is happening across this region, and regardless of the fact that, or regardless of the patterns that are seen in the sediment thicknesses, if you add together the sediment and water thicknesses, more subsidence is happening here than there. Other contemporaneous basins have very similar basin fill, going from diamictites to either marine or deltaic or lake deposits. And here's some of the contemporaneous Karoo basins that have Dwika-Eka fill. The Adanos Basin in Namibia continues underneath Cretaceous cover in Botswana, continuing even into the Zambezi Valley in northern Zimbabwe. I got that wrong, there's northern Zimbabwe over there. So continuing into the Zambezi Valley in Zimbabwe, Tete Province in Mozambique, Zambia, Malawi, Tanzania, the DRC, many of these southern African basins are extensional or site slip. They're rift basins that exploit previously existing sutures in the crust. So things like the Ilmenite and Bendian belts, the Limpopo belt, sutures over here. So many of these things exploit pre-existing fractures. Some of them are mostly intercratonic. We probably don't have a good sense of what's underneath them. And so this is a large sag basin. I would like to imagine that they fit quite well onto these two axes. And so I would like to explain their existence and their formation in terms of north-south oriented compression. I guess you can see where I'm going with this. That could equate to east-west extension. And so the formation of all of these rift basins that have an overprint by basement structure. I would like to consider them to be impactogens that are forming in response to subduction and or collision, and they're forming from the Carboniferous when the Dwika starts to be deposited. These basins are not filled by, or are not associated with volcanics. They're not forming in response to active rifting, and so it's hard to imagine that they're forming by passive rifting with extension to the south either, because this is a continental landmass that is moving from a pole northwards to a temperate regime. And so it's hard to explain those basins by either active or passive extensional rifting. Normal fault movement in foreland systems. Some models invoke normal movement along sedimentary structures. There's ways to do it. Sediment loading on active thrust sheets can cause normal movement from the weight of the sediment pile during periods of quiescence. And this is documented in places. This example from the Cenomanian of Utah, I picked it, it's a good example. This guy has two special characters in his name, and I thought it was worthwhile entering anyways. And so fault movement along fault systems here causes great variations in the thickness of contemporaneous units across basement structures. And that may be one way to explain normal fault movement in the overall compressional regime. And an idea getting close to finishing is that we have here, say, a Carboniferous foreland basin profile. We have the Cargonian highlands covered in ice that is depositing diamictites in the uplifted continental environments. Maybe a way to explain the fact that the Karoo Basin doesn't have a perfect foreland basin profile is that there's some effect from, or a subsidence driven by ice weight. And of course, ice being a third of the density of rock, you would need 3 times as much ice as you could use sediment to achieve the same goals. And so it may be that 4-bulge subsidence is slightly subdued by the weight of an ice, or 4-bulge uplift is subdued by the weight of an ice sheet, and that may go some way to explaining why there is no 4-bulge unconformity in the base of the Karoo. You could have Dwightar deposition in the flanks of the 4-bulge at a time where it's relatively subsided, and that would be followed by very rapid transgression from post-glacial meltwaters, as well as the onset of foreland conditions. And that's basically what I say in my conclusions. How am I doing for time? Okay, I'm coming to the end. So, the biggest problem with what I'm showing you is the absence of a southerly sediment source in the Carboniferous Permian. There's no evidence of sediment feeding from the Cape Fold Belt into the Dwightar. The glaciers all move the other way off the Caledonian Highlands. And so that's one thing that needs an explanation. I don't know what the answer is, but if you really want, I'll put some ideas out there. Going into the ECA, the 4-deep, 4-bulge morphology is a very good explanation of the subsidence profile that we see and the environmental variations that we see. Karoo basins north of the main Karoo basin are perhaps most elegantly explained as impactogens, and they originate from the same tectonic drivers as the main Karoo basin. And final thought is that the Beaufort group has stratigraphy that very, very closely matches the Reservoir foreland basin stratigraphy. The Eka-Beaufort contact is largely conformable and a very good match for Walter's law, going from marginal marine deltaic into fluvial systems. That's a conformable contact, and so it's hard to imagine the Eka-Beaufort representing a transition in a successor basin from one subsidence style to another. And so it seems to me most parsimonious to have the Eka, and for the same reasons, or similar reasons, have the Dwightar as part of the foreland system. Thank you.
One question, please. One question.
It's just a comment, really. It's true that there aren't paleoclines pointing from south in the southern fasces in the early part of the Dwightar, but in sequences 2, 3, and 4 that were described by Fisser in great detail, there is an increasing trend of southern paleocurrents. This, of course, does not deny the foreland basin model's validity.
Yeah, the big problem with the Dwightar is that everything that's documented is moving south, and there isn't anything documented moving north from the Cape Fold Belt. So an explanation is needed if the Cape Fold Belt exists as to why there is no northward transport of sediment. And the explanation I'd like to give is that the Fold Belt is so far away at that time that none of that sediment got preserved.
Zubair, my point was that there is paleocurrent from south to north. Oh. In the southern fasces, in sequences 2, 3, and 4, it's becoming increasingly dominant.
Okay, well that ties in even better.
Thank you very much, Zubair.